Namaste and welcome everyone for the third session of our virtual conference series. It's a partnership between Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America and Hindu University of America. And our kind of topic and headline has been Enlivening Hindu Heritage, Voices of Diaspora-Raised Hindus. This is the third session focusing on filmmakers. And you may have heard that October has been declared Hindu Heritage Month at city councils all across the United States and around the world. And so this conference is picking up on that theme. And of course, we have VHPA, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, the oldest Hindu organization in the United States, over 52 years of many pivotal accomplishments, works, groups, organizations, including founding Supportachal Ekal Vidyalaya Hindu Students Council, as well as Hindu University of America. And of course, HUA, Hindu University of America, doing the work, right? In so many different ways. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, this conference. And there's so much to this, and maybe I'll just read this real quick. Traditional Hindu institutions recognize that their sustenance is predicated on the increased involvement of diaspora-raised Hindus in their institutions and the community moving forward. Simultaneously, diaspora-raised Hindus would like to see these institutions better reflect their perspectives and their vision for the Hindu community, and this conference seeks to bridge that gap. Our panels are aimed to center the voices of diaspora-raised Hindus and the ways in which they enliven Hindu heritage in their personal and professional lives. And so we believe this will create new pathways for ongoing stewardship of Hindu heritage generations to come. And so today's panel, let me introduce our moderator, who is going to be none other than Dr. Indu Vishwanathan. Always a pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Indu Vishwanathan with us. And she is so accomplished in so many ways. She's got a doctorate in education from the Teachers College of Columbia. She has a BA in economics from Cornell and an MA in elementary education from Teachers College, Columbia University. And she's been a long-time student of Gurudevji Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, I think over 15 years now. And she started her career as an economist at Citigroup, but she decided to become a teacher to align her work with the Dharma. And she's spent since then 20 years, maybe a little bit more than that, in the field of education, global experience, program design, teacher education, serving American public schools, and bringing that wisdom and experience to the Hindu community in a lot of different projects. And again, she is now serving as the director of education for Hindu University of America. It is our pleasure. She's actually a second generation Hindu American herself. She's got, I think, two boys, right? So you're raising third generation Hindu Americans, and through that experience of putting them through school, experiencing it as we know our mothers often do, the divine mother taking care of us in so many different ways. She's also, and the last thing I'll say is she's the co-founder and co-director of Understanding Hinduphobia, an initiative to increase public consciousness and discourse about Hinduphobia, build allyship, and nurture scholarship. So again, with that, let me just introduce and hand it off to Indu Vishwanathan, Dr. Vishwanathan. Thank you for being here and moderating this wonderful panel of Hindu filmmakers, or from the Hindu perspective. There we go.
Thank you, Ankur. And as always, I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your unwavering support. Namaskaram, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to go over a few kind of points about how the panel is going to run. So a reminder, just as Ankur reviewed, this is a conference series that features diaspora born and raised Hindus. So these are diaspora born and raised Hindu filmmakers. Of course, there's an entire universe of India born and raised Hindu filmmakers, but just keep that in mind when we're listening to and engaging with these panelists. The second reminder is to please put your questions in the Q&A feature and not through the chat, because it'll get lost in the chat, and we want to make sure we get to your questions after I sort of prompt a few initial questions. And the third is, please try your best not to get pulled into these intense side conversations in the chat that can often happen during these panels. Sometimes we even get these trolls that are looking to distract from what's happening in the main panel. So let's do our best to have some vairagya and move through this with some dispassion and equanimity. So with that, it is my pleasure to begin to introduce our panelists. So I will begin with Ravi Chand. Born in Fiji of Indian heritage, Ravi Chand's stories and work reflect his indigenous Indian, Hindu, and Fijian Indian identity, culture, and communities. His docuseries, 5 Year Grandma, which received Screen Australia development funding, features Ravi's breathtaking reconnection to his culture when he found out his maternal grandma, who he thought had passed away decades ago, was still alive and waiting for him in Fiji. His production company, Warrior Tribe Films, is dedicated to the legacy of his grandmother, which he channels through his screen work to inspire emancipation from assimilation, colonization, and patriarchy. The Warrior Tribe Films logo is the same tattoo Ravi and his grandma share. Ravi recently completed a Bharatanatyam piece for Australian national producer ABC for their Artworks program. Its Facebook video has become one of the most popular posts for the ABC art page. His kids' drama TV project called Namaste Yoga is also soon to air nationally on ABC TV Australia in 2022, with international distribution in the works. Namaste Yoga is about the appropriation of yoga and the impact that has on young Hindu kids and their self-worth when their culture is appropriated, commoditized, and sold back to them. Welcome, Ravi.
Welcome. Thank you. Namaste.
Michael Collins is the founder of Thoughtful Robot Productions, committed to sharing stories that inspire, connect, and galvanize change since 2003. Michael's first film, Give Up Tomorrow, about an innocent man on death row in the Philippines, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2011, where it won the Audience Award and a special jury prize for Best New Director. It was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism and won 18 awards worldwide. Almost Sunrise chronicles the transformative journey of 2 Iraq War veterans and was the first film to discuss moral injury. It was honored with awards from SAMHSA and the National Association of Social Workers and was nominated for an Emmy Award in 2018 for Outstanding Current Affairs Documentary. Michael has created a number of short films, including Unveiling Infinity, which chronicles 2 weeks in the life of global spiritual leader and humanitarian Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. In 2022, Michael released 2 films, an environmental thriller set in the Philippines he produced, wrote, and edited called Delicado, which just had a national US broadcast on POV, and Beirut Dreams in Color, about a trailblazing rock band's daunting battle against religious extremists in the Middle East. A few days ago, both films were shortlisted for the IDA Documentary Awards. In addition to filmmaking, Michael volunteers as a meditation and breathwork instructor, working with a wide range of populations, including the LGBTQ community, veterans, and military families suffering from PTSD and moral injury. Michael has been a student of Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar since 2003. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Nicholas Oskoff is an executive creative producer. He's been working in the film space for 15 years, producing commercials, branded content, and documentary content. Based in New York for the first 10 years of his career, Nicholas has been a first AD, line producer, and ultimately executive producer for Good Day Film. Through his production career, he has worked with some of the largest brands and agencies in the US and abroad. Having significant foreign experience and language skills allows him to produce work internationally as well as locally at his base in LA. Before transitioning into film production, he worked at the United Nations in New York, and he earned a master's degree in international affairs and conflict resolution from the American University of Paris. Nicholas also writes and creates original content and is currently developing a slate of narrative and documentary projects, including a documentary on yoga and the role India has played in the spiritual revolution taking place across the globe. Welcome, Nico.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you. Thank you so much.
Of course. And finally, last but not least, we have Praneeth Madhu, who's the director of Project Janani. After graduating from the Ohio State University in 2021 with a degree in mathematics and neuroscience, Praneeth Madhu is a first-year medical student at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He took a gap year from his academic interests to combine a need for increasing awareness about Hindu Dharma with his long-lasting interest in film by directing Project Janani, the first documentary independently produced by Hindu youth. Welcome, Praneeth. Okay.
Namaste, everyone.
Namaste. So my first question for all of you, and maybe we'll start with Ravi, since you're all the way out in Australia. We'll start with you first. The question for everyone is tell us about your journey as a Hindu and as a filmmaker.
Okay, so I was born in Fiji. Our ancestors came from India because they were tricked by the British to become slaves in the Caribbean, South Africa, Mauritius, and Fiji. And we migrated into Australia in 1982. I really struggled moving into Australia. I could barely talk English when I first got into Australia, and it was very rare to see another person of colour, not just in my school, but in the entire neighbourhood. So growing up, I faced a lot of racism, particularly when I went to a private school and got a lot there. A week from my 12th birthday, my mother passed away in a car accident when her car was hit by a speeding van, and we got cut off from all mum's side of the family. And I guess for me, I'm struggling to find a place to belong. I attached myself to the one thing that I thought I could gain some acceptance in, which was trying to become as Australian as I possibly could. I found that a lot of times, because I was trying to fit into the world of being Australian, I'd face a lot of issues with the Indian community, particularly, saying that I was too white, or from everything to the color of my skin being too dark. So I guess I kind of shunned the community for a while, and then my dad remarried my stepmother, and she was a wonderful spiritual woman, and our house became a Hindu temple, and so I grew up in a Hindu temple, and at the same time I was still trying to navigate what my identity was like at home and what it was like outside. I was either getting into fights all the time for people calling me racist names, or trying to hide in a shell, so I just blend in. And then I struggled a lot, I guess, with my identity. And I guess as a Girimit, which is what we're called, ancestors from India, and mamas from the mum's side of families from the south, dads from the north, and you feel this perpetual sense of spiritual homelessness. You don't know where to really connect and where you really belong. And even my parents have said, when they, dad and my stepmother have said, when they get into India, they immediately know that people know they're not from India. And so I really struggled a lot. And I guess when you get older, you then realize, the assimilation that you've gone through was never going to work anyway. You cannot change the color of your skin. And it all changed for me when I found out that my maternal grandma, who I thought had passed away, was still alive. And she reconnected me to my language. It was the first time I spoke our dialect of Hindi in 25 years, because she couldn't speak English, so I had to speak to her in that. And I guess I started questioning, where do we come from? What is our Indigenous culture? And mainly because the issues that I had with this simulation, I don't want that to be passed on to my son or to younger generations. And so all of my work is about connecting to the true essence of who we are, and so that our younger and future generations don't feel ashamed of who they are, and not being able to navigate and feeling like they have to pick a side between their Western culture or their Hindu culture as well.
Thank you for that. Who would like to go next? Go for it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Well, I've been a seeker for a long time. And so when I was in my teen years here in Southern California, I was born and raised in Southern California, to a Coptic Egyptian father and a Catholic mother. So we traveled a lot to visit family and things, and I was exposed to lots of different cultures. When I was about 15 years old, I came across a Deepak Chopra book, and that was the first foray for me into Eastern thinking and Indian philosophy, and that really set me on a path, I would say. So I have I have a lot to thank Deepak for in that regard. But so when I was 15, I really started reading everything I could get my hands on that came out of the Indian tradition. I started traveling to India in my early 20s, and I went through a phase where I was very interested in Buddhism and different sects of Hinduism. And then about 12 years ago or so, I came across a book about Sri Ramakrishna. That book was written by Lex Hickson. It's called The Great Swan. And that book really introduced me to Sri Ramakrishna. And from that day, I was kind of his devotee, and I remain his devotee. And as I like to say, he answered all of my questions, Sri Ramakrishna did. And so I started studying and reading everybody in his orbit and in his sphere. And I learned about Swami Vivekananda, who I'm now making a film on. And so that's kind of how I got into the Hindu tradition. And of course, in the spirit of Sri Ramakrishna, who was so liberal in his spiritual and religious outlook, I really do appreciate the mystical traditions from all over the world. And so I consider myself, yes, Hindu, but also Sanatan Dharma and the eternal religion, and the, I'm a kind of a spiritual enthusiast, I would say, but my heart is very much Hindu. And so that's the spiritual side of things. And then I've been working in film for about 17 years now. And I got into film because I used to work at the UN, and I thought that that would have been a very good place for me to help to create social change and so forth. And then when I moved into my master's degree in Paris, I was studying in Paris in international relations and conflict resolution. And in my last year there, I saw a film. And that film had such an impact on me, and it made me understand that storytelling is really the most powerful medium to create change. So whereas large organizations sometimes can be, very top heavy, like the UN, I found that filmmaking can really inspire the desire to change and so forth. And so from, it was kind of ironic because it was right at the end of my degree that I figured that I wanted to move into the film space, and that's what I did. And if you're curious about what the film was, it was Blood Diamond. And I just thought that really raised my awareness of a social issue. And it kind of dawned on me that storytelling is really the right way, for me anyway, to do some good if I can. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Nico. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Praneeth Madhu. So I grew up in the United States. I did my entire education here. And I think starting from a pretty early age, I've sort of noticed the bigotry towards Hindus. I come from a pretty religious Hindu family. So it was a large part of my identity growing up. And the fact that it wasn't necessarily accepted, not only in the social space, but also in the educational space, was very troublesome on me growing up. And I really started noticing it in high school when my peers also sort of just threw away their identity and culture conveniently in a sort of forced convenience. And since then, I, would just gather a small group of high schoolers, my peers, and we would just talk about Hindu topics just for exposure and just so we can get some discussion started on them. In college, the sort of issue became worse because college students have sort of a newfound independence, and that force of their parents, giving the culture to them has now disappeared. So in college, it usually gets worse. And I became the president of a Hindu student organization on college, which I work with. And it's not only about creating awareness for Hindu culture, right? It's just minority culture in general has struggled a lot. And it's about having these conversations for creating awareness for minority cultures and Hinduism specifically, Hindu Dharma specifically. In terms of filmmaking, I've always been interested in filmmaking. I've always had a knack for storytelling and for the visual arts. Never really had the time to really pursue it or get into it. And I'm definitely not as experienced as all the other folks on this panel. But I saw a need for it. I saw a need for me to engage in this space and tell stories coming from a unique perspective of being a Hindu-born American, sort of going through the entire system here and how that sort of affected me and others like me. I felt the need to tell that story, which is why I took a year off from my education and started Project Janani. We've crowdfunded everything, so we didn't go to a production house because we wanted the creative hold on what we're saying. And the community has been super generous towards us in raising funds and helping complete production. We're in post-production right now, doing the editing and all that. And hopefully it should be out sometime next year for you all to watch.
Thank you, Praneeth. All right, Michael, that leaves you.
Well, thank you first of all for having me, and just really an honor to be here with all you guys. And congrats, Praneeth, on being in post-production. That's a big moment. Excited to see the film when it comes out soon. My journey began, I guess, as a filmmaker, and I guess on the spiritual path, sort of consciously or intentionally, simultaneously, about 19 years ago. I was living in New York City, and I guess I was always a seeker as well, as Nicholas said, and I didn't even realize it. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that I was always looking, searching, trying to find a place where I belong, trying to find home, trying to find something. And it led me to New York City. Of course, I searched in a lot of the wrong places for a while, as a lot of us do when we're younger. I was living pretty intense lifestyle. And then I remember when the Dalai Lama used to come to New York City, Richard Gere would bring him there for like 8 days every year, and you'd go to the Upper West Side. And I was living in the Lower East Side and, kind of living a whole different lifestyle, but I would just go up there. I just needed to be in that space, but there was something about it that didn't stick for me. But it's still, I was drawn to it. And then I learned how to meditate by chance. I went and learned the Sudarshan Kriya Yoga practice because I was having trouble sleeping, and someone recommended it. And that was ultimately where I met my teacher, Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. And a couple of months later, I had the opportunity to start working on my first film, which was Give Up Tomorrow. I was an art director at the time, working in a little communication company in New York City, and I quit, and my partner quit his job, and we both just packed up, and there was a story that needed to be told about a young man who was innocent on death row in the Philippines. And so we just dropped everything and went. And that, for me, was how my journey began as a filmmaker. But I'll also say, if I didn't have that practice, that sky meditation practice, that Sudarshan Kriya Yoga, I wouldn't have been able to make that film. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done at that point. It was extremely stressful. I had no idea what I was doing. I remember being on the plane to the Philippines, literally reading the manual to the camera, like how to use it. And it was while I was there, doing my practice every day that just brought me back to my center. So I got to experience really practically how these practices were bringing me back to myself. And I think that's ultimately what I was seeking. I was trying to find myself. I had lost that somewhere along the way. And I think, I just, over the years working on that film, showing up for it, de-stressing, I just got to realize that I could be creative, to do something with purpose. All the things that I wanted to do so much, and all the while just deepening and deepening my practice and my connection to my teacher. And it was like everything just started to interweave. Things were less and less compartmentalized. And so I guess that's where my journey, on both fronts started.
Thank you for that. You're talking about, you use the word integrated, and I think that's interesting, right? Because this idea of integration came up in our last panel that we had 2 weeks ago on Hindus who are working in the area of social good. And it's about living this integrated life where your work in the world is in the compass for that is dharma. So that's a natural segue into my next question, which is, and you can take this up however you'd like, how do you understand and enact dharmic filmmaking?
I think I can start us off. This is definitely a hard question, because when we think of what dharma is, it's something that's constantly changing, constantly universal. So as filmmakers, we're constantly learning in that sense. We're constantly changing what our idea of dharma even is, right? As we sort of talked about before, filmmaking is important for social change, and dharma is definitely centered around holistic wellness of the entire universe. So filmmaking towards that cause is definitely an important aspect of dharmic filmmaking, I think, with no limitation in sort of the stories we tell. If we think about the original sort of filmmakers or writers in our lineage, being like Valmiki or Vyasa, right? They told all sorts of stories. They told stories about war, they told stories about relationships, they told stories about parents. So they weren't limited in that sense. So dharmic filmmaking isn't necessarily a limited space, but it's sort of the intention in which we tell those stories, or the philosophy with which we tell those stories, that's important. And I think that's sort of a philosophy that's based on this idea of universal wellness.
I'll pick up from there. That was very nice. Thank you. For me, this is an interesting question, because the word dharma is such a, it's such a rich word, and it's always so important to define terms. I understand that defining terms it's crucial and language is so limiting sometimes. So, but for me, dharmic filmmaking means that I have a certain responsibility to be making my film as dharmically as I can, which means I really need to stay centered in my practice and make sure that I'm listening to all of the instincts within me that tell me if I'm on the right track or not. So that's very important, because I have an inner sense, we all do, of when I'm stepping off track or taking the easy way out on something or whatever it may be. So that, I would say, is one component of it. Also, picking up on what Michael said, and also what Induji said, integration is so key. And I've found that in my own life, as I get older, it's wonderful to have a less compartmentalized life. My work and my spiritual journey are really starting to come together, and it's like it just makes all of life joyful and much more pleasant and easy. And I can feel that I'm placed exactly where I need to be, and doing the work that I need to be doing. So that feels very dharmic. And then the last thing I'll say is that for my project, I'm doing something on the Hindu Dharma and how the Hindu Dharma has influenced the West so profoundly since, from my perspective, since Swami Vivekananda was here in America in 1893. So really focusing on the Hindu Dharma and how it's influencing all of our lives here in America, and then America being such a kind of a trampoline, if you will, for things to go around the world. So it's kind of a convoluted answer, but that's what comes to me as far as dharmic filmmaking. Thank you.
I can relate to a lot of that, I guess. Yeah, I mean, to think about this for me, it's like you said, how am I living? How am I expressing it in my work? How's the process dharmic as well? It's not just about, I'm not just looking at the end product. How am I showing up? You know, for me, this is all just a journey really of self-inquiry. And, you know, for so many years, I've looked at all the different films in the industry. I start to understand that a lot of them are sort of looking at the symptoms of what's going on in the world. And when I think about this path, this knowledge, these practices, my experience, it always goes so much deeper. And then so as I grow and as I learn, and I want to have my work be an expression of that, you know, for me, it just feels like having my work go deeper. How, if I'm on a journey of self-discovery, if ultimately that's what this is all about, how is my process allowing those I work with, or, you know, creating space for other people to have that experience, and how is the final product also doing that? And that can look so many different ways to, you know, especially in documentary. It's, you know, if I'm going across the country through middle America with a very colorful crew and, you know, who are used to behaving certain ways when they're on set, how am I modeling something that is an invitation? You know, the final piece itself, how is it speaking to something that's deeper and actually pointing towards healing and connection and bringing people together, as opposed to pointing to just blame and you know, some more superficial and kind of surface level things. So yeah, I guess for me, it's just always just remaining curious, remaining in that state of inquiry, and trying to inspire that in other, both in the process and in the final product.
I guess for me, dharma is about service to my community, and the way in which I go about doing that service to my community, that the work that is being done doesn't belong to me. It's not my work. It is something that's being done for the community, and that will last many lifetimes before me, and I'm quite insignificant to that. And also remembering that I need to understand that there is no possible way, even as a filmmaker, I don't take creative license on things. I deeply entrench elders and community involved from the very concept of what the story that I'm going to tell. And I purposely choose people that are going to call me out when it needs to be called out, or really get to the truth of what we're trying to explore. And for me, dharma is walking that path of truth, not just in the end product, as I was saying before, it's the process of how we get there. How does everybody that we come in contact with feel that dharma of what that is? Dharma is also something that I feel like you feel with. It's beyond the mind of trying to describe what it actually is. And so sometimes it feels like doing also what's right and what's not easy. And sometimes that may mean going completely against the grain of everybody in that room because you know the truth that needs to be told. And doing that with kindness sometimes, and sometimes standing your ground because you need to, but always in the service of community and always in service of our Paramatma and Shuji and Kali Mata for me.
Thank you for that. You know, that actually leads me to a little bit more of a simpler question. What are popular misconceptions that people have about making films? Outside of the film industry, just the everyday person. Maybe they manifest as questions or demands that you hear all the time. I know, having been friends with Michael for so many years, there are a lot of questions and demands that he hears all the time. And here's kind of a chance to address them. What are the top 3 things that you want the Hindu community to know about filmmaking? And Michael, I'll put you on the spot and start with you.
Okay. Well, it's funny. I'm just finishing up sort of 3 months of early production on a new project. And for about half of that, I was sleeping on a floor in a room with someone else with no door. And so the misconception that it might be glamorous to make a film, I guess something, someone who's maybe been at this for a while. I was very happily sleeping on the floor, but I was still sleeping on the floor, that it's misconceptions that I guess, that you have to have some kind of, that you have to have gone to film school, perhaps, is one. I think having that need to tell a story is something that you can't ignore. And I think that is something that I've learned as I've gotten a little bit older, is that really these stories are coming through and you have to be present just to say yes and kind of get out of the way and let it happen and just keep on moving. And that, maybe there's another misconception, like, what you're doing. I have no idea what I'm doing most of the time. And it's being in that state of more of a playful I don't know, as opposed to a terrified I don't know. I think that allows the story to come through, because it is terrifying. You're raising a lot of money, you're calling together a lot of people, you're taking on a tremendous amount of responsibility when you ask someone to share their story with you and to do all those things. But there's a reason why you're asking. There's a reason why you're taking these steps. So trust that and just keep on showing up and putting one foot in front of the other. And, just know that you're not the doer, that there is something creative that's trying to be born, and you're just being used. And what a gift that is.
Thank you for that. Nico, I'm going to tag you next because you were smiling a lot.
Yeah, I thank you. I can identify with so much. I love what Michael said about that. What you're doing, if that's because clearly, who really knows what they're doing in anything? Of course, we train and we experience is such a great teacher, but getting comfortable in the idea that every time you're out doing something, it really is such a new process because there's always shifting dynamics and so forth. So I really identify with that idea. So misconceptions, I would say what I've come across in my experience is that a lot of times people, this is maybe more for clients, in the commercial space, but that it's easy, or that if we just want to change one thing, it's like a root. It's if you move one piece of a project, a lot of other pieces have to move to make a change, So it's quite a Jenga, the process of filmmaking. So there's that. Also for me, and this is really just a personal thing, but I've come to understand that for me to execute a project well, I have to have singularity of purpose in a way. So it's a very difficult thing. I know there's a lot of filmmakers and great multitaskers out there. I think multitasking is a little bit overrated, at least in my experience, because, this particular project that I'm working on now, the life and legacy of Swami Vivekananda, it's only really started to gain power and Shakti, if you will, since I made it so that I can work just on this, and I can really allow every day. It's like every day I'm working on this, whether consciously or not, and pieces are changing, the story is changing, and there are so many in the documentary film space. You have to wear so many hats. One day I'm dealing with financing, one day I'm dealing with creative, one day I'm dealing with crew, one day I'm dealing with gear. It's just such a massive process. And for me to have singularity of purpose is a great gift. And I think it will speak in the final product. And then the last thing I'll say is that filmmaking is quite a collaborative process. So even if, you look at a film and you see that it's directed by a certain person, really there's so many people whose influence is paramount to the final product. And that's why when you see, someone on stage accepting an award, the list of thank yous is so long, because it really is such a collaborative process. Yes, I I'm in a position in this project where I get to get as much information from others and it filters through me. And then back to the dharmic piece, I have to use my intuition. And I point that way because Michael's currently making a film on intuition, which we were talking about. And so intuition to what, what works for this project and what doesn't. So although the director might have the final say in some cases, at least in theory, it really is such a collaborative and beautiful and amazing process. And I feel very lucky to be doing this. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ravi?
I think really understanding the context of, I guess if you look at the education system and universities and the way that works within a very colonial construct of the way that that is actually developed as a structure, and then you take it into the construct of filmmaking and story writing, that sits within a very colonial construct as it is. So a lot of Indigenous communities, when there's this a big movement for a lot of diverse stories, but I guess one of the things to be very aware of is the layers that sit underneath that as well. It's one thing to have diverse stories, but it's another thing to be able to tell those stories within the way that we tell our stories. What is of great significance to us can seem like something that's inconvenient on set when it's time and money that's traveling very fast. And so as a filmmaker, you have to be prepared for that well in advance. And that comes through experience and being around the right people that can guide you through that. So it can make you feel like when you're beginning that you really don't belong. And I guess that what colonialism basically was, its intent was. And so you have to persist and know the reason of why you're doing it. And that will guide you through. So I guess one of the misconceptions I feel like is, that all this experience of being in film school will, is Trump's life experience. And I feel like that authenticity of life experience and what you go through is the story. And on top of that as well, people think that, they always want to see this particular hero, and there's this hero of, they're like the saving the day kind of thing. But what people really connect to is the vulnerability of people. And that's what seems more genuine than anything else. So when you're writing a story, don't thinking of the Hollywood film that you've seen of how as a hero has been portrayed. Think about the moments in your life that you've been really vulnerable and put that into your character as you're writing. So I think one of the misconceptions is always trying to look towards what's already out there and using that as a template. People aren't looking for what's already been done. They're looking for that new thing, that thing that really connects, and that comes from your own lived experience and your background.
That's really powerful, Ravi. It kind of harkens back to the previous question, which is, what does Dharma have to offer the film space? And I think a lot of that is that nuance and that, that moral dilemma versus moral certitude around this idea of a hero. I think that's really powerful. Praneeth, you're new to the film space, so I'm sure this question resonates very differently for you.
No, for sure. Like 1 year ago or 1.5 years ago, I wouldn't be calling myself a filmmaker. So there are definitely sort of surprises that came during this entire process, and the things that have already been said echo so well with me. It's so true. But sort of adding on to that, one thing I think people aren't aware of is how many different moving parts there are. And Nicholas sort of alluded to this with the Jenga example, but a lot of people just think film is about like picking up a camera, shooting something, and then posting it online. But there's just so much before you even pick up the camera and after you pick up the camera that are oftentimes much more important than, what's going on in set. And even during, during production, the art, although the most important part of it, is just a fraction of what's happening, right? You're constantly dealing with other people. The schedule is constantly changing, especially in documentary work. Every day you're faced with new challenges that completely risks your entire schedule, that can sometimes stop the entire film from happening. And it's just, you're just constantly faced with challenges on a daily basis. You have to be constantly problem solving. And, you know, that's sort of the appeal of filmmaking in some way, the sort of problem solving nature of it. But that's something that's behind the scenes that a lot of people, the audience, don't know about, is how much work went into every single frame that you see in a film.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question, and Ravi, I'm giving you a heads up. I'm going to ask you to answer this first, because you kind of, you did begin to talk about this in your previous response. What are the challenges and opportunities in creating dharmic films, whether it's about approaching the process dharmically or if the topic is Hindus or Hinduism?
I guess there are a lot of unconscious biases that are out there at the moment, and particularly, I can talk about my experience of being someone with brown skin and Hindu. You're always 10 steps ahead of the conversation of where this is going. And you've just got to be very aware of that minefield that you're walking into, that sometimes people aren't ready to hear the truth, and how that, or nor do they want to accept what the truth is. So it is just a matter of timing, and you have to be patient. This isn't a short-term sprint, it's a long-term career, and I guess a long-term pathway. I've been doing this for, not as long as some, but 15 years, and only in like the past 2-3 years have I started getting paid for it. So, I guess you have to be very, whilst I say that you've got to call out those structures that you're within and talk to your truth, you have to also be very aware of the power dynamics that are in place. I can say those things now because I've had the opportunity to talk with in-screen bodies and have those conversations, but I didn't go in with guns blazing. I stepped my way through that because that door, we were very aware of it, that door can be closed on us very, very quickly. So you just have to be very aware of that.
Praneeth, I saw you nodding a little bit, so I'm going to tag you next.
Yeah, definitely. I feel this a lot, not only in filmmaking work, but just in like being a Hindu, being a practicing Hindu, and I'm sort of seeing the hate that's sort of thrown around Hindu Dharma, and even like responding to that, right? It's just people, like Ravi Chandji said, they just aren't willing to accept the truth. And a lot of times, it's, even in this process of filmmaking, there's since the field of knowledge is so large, since there's just so much to Hindu Dharma, there's, it's Sanatan, it's eternal. Sometimes there's also a fear in accuracy, like, did I get this correct? Right? Because there's only so much we can know. There's only so much we can digest as learners. So there's this constant fear of whether I have this concept down correctly, whether it can be even more accurate, or who do I need to speak to present this more accurately. And I'm sure the others, having made much more in this field, can talk a bit more about that specifically.
Nico?
Thank you for calling on me, because I just want to piggyback totally on what Praneeth just said. For me, it's a great responsibility. It feels like a really, it's a big responsibility to take these figures, for example, I can only speak to from my own experience, but as I'm making a film on characters like Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and these massive, enlightened beings, it's just a great responsibility to catch them from the right angle and to put it out on film, because film is a language and language is limiting. And so if I say Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna's message to the world, or whatever, however I end up doing that, is this, well, yeah, from one angle it is, but there's such entire beings, as are so many of these beings that inspire us from the Hindu Dharma, that it's just, if I say they're one thing, then am I saying they're not something else, And so it's a great responsibility. And that also leads back to the dharmic filmmaking. So I can only do my best to paint a picture that I believe is going to be inspiring and nurturing and so forth. So that's really a hard thing to do, to make sure that I'm doing justice to these characters. And then also, I'm kind of a guest in a way in this tradition. Not a guest because I'm not going anywhere ever. However, I'm not, born and raised in the Hindu community. I'm a Westerner. And so I think there is certainly an added layer of responsibility for me to, have the gall, so to speak, to take these figures and to introduce them. Well, not that they need introduction, but to those who don't know them, to put them on film. It's just a great responsibility, extra responsibility, because I'm a Westerner, and so the topic and the issue of appropriation is something I'm very keenly aware of, and so I have my fail safes to make sure that I'm doing my best to honor the culture, not just in its not just historically, but also today. And so it is a great responsibility, and I know that in the end, I'm not going to please everyone either, and that's just something I think you have to get comfortable with as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is, the films that I've been making, it's more been about the process for me, and how these traditions, these practices, this culture, how I've been honoring them in my own life and bringing it to life just in how I move through the world, and how I tell stories, and how I connect with the people that I'm working with or the subjects of my film. I guess, when I made Almost Sunrise, there was something that did come up where, I had these two veterans who were dealing with moral injury. Basically, they were, they had to do things in war that go against their moral compass, and it was destroying them. And we're sort of taking the conversation beyond post-traumatic stress. And it was just a wound to the soul is really how it's described. And they walked across the country to try to make themselves feel better, and it didn't work. But when they sat down and they did this ancient practice, this breath-based meditation practice, and then they had this big cathartic kind of release, it was, in some ways kind of a clash of worlds. I'm dealing with sort of a middle America veteran, a lot of real Christian kind of space, and yet they were embracing these ancient practices that were made available to them, that were giving them so much, they transformed because of these things. So how to share that story in a way, I think, that is aware of the nuance and the complication of the conversation at large that is going on around these spaces, and that is going to continue to be inviting people in. And I didn't, making choices around how far to dig deep into where this stuff comes from, as opposed to just knowing that I have an impact campaign that's going to go on for years, that's going to involve people now learning these practices and actually setting everyone up to have the experience themselves and not get stuck in some of the traps that the media has been laying for us for so many years. And I think navigating that, that was something that was that I had to reach out and ask people for help with. It's a little bit complicated, and I think that's just always the space that I'm coming from, is knowing that I don't always know, like always asking questions, listening more than sort of talking. And I feel like I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's what helped me. That's what continues to help me as I make these films, is just sort of being, I guess, humble and going back to that place of stillness to see what feels like the next move.
Michael, you mentioned this idea of an impact campaign. I know specifically, I know you and Ravi, and maybe Nico, you've taken this up in your work as well, but can you describe what an impact campaign is? Because I think the general public doesn't think of film as something that's a part of something much bigger. They think of film as the final thing, as opposed to the beginning of something.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I take that for granted. I mean, when I make films, I'm usually thinking of the impact campaign as I start making the film. A lot these days, it's usually just sort of that desire for some change in the world that inspires me to want to set out on the journey to tell the story in the first place. So when I look at my distribution model, I'm weaving impact into that. That's, I want that to be the driving force. I don't see sort of like the festivals and theatrical and all that as separate from impact. I'm trying to see how much can I make that sort of Venn diagram like overlap as much as possible. So how is it that this film can reach the community that I'm intending it for, or that, as meaningfully as possible? And, so as I'm making the film, I'm building partnerships. I'm thinking, okay, if it's in the space of veterans and mental health and healing, who are the partners that I want that have the loudest voice? If there's tens of thousands of them, I want to pick the best of the best, and I want to start bringing them into the conversation and asking them what they need, not just thinking I know what they need. So that actually may even inform, that's part of the research and development as I'm telling a story. I think that this is what's driving me. This is what looks, from my small perspective, looks like what's wrong in this space. But then I really get to know all the people who are on the front line doing the work, and we start to form partnerships. So when this piece of media drops, it hits the ground running. How are we getting as much traction with it as possible? How are we moving the needle as much as possible? Making it available to the people who need it, how many different forms are we putting it out in? Not everyone can sit down for a 90-minute film. Am I considering making shorter versions? Am I making a lesson plan, a discussion guide for students? Or so I could go on and on, but it really just has to do with, it is a separate production. I have a budget for my film production, then I have a budget for my impact campaign, and it's another project. And it's often the one that excites me the most, because that's when I'm out there, just like the process of making the film, when you're not in the edit for a documentary filmmaker, when you're connecting with people, when I'm out there with the film, traveling with it, or giving it to the film subjects and letting them do it, it's a very different, it's a very exciting part of the process and the most satisfying.
And Ravi, I know you've taken this up very, I would say, boldly. In the process of making your films or your media, you've actually started to shift policy within some of these places. So do you want to talk about that experience a little bit?
Yeah, I think impact producing is something certainly that emerging filmmakers should really look into as part of their process, particularly if you're wanting to create change. So if you think of the film or the documentary or that piece of work as creating emotion so that people feel something and that they go, well, how can I make change to this? How can I find out more about this? This is where the impact producing kicks in, but it's not an afterthought. It's very much a strategic plan that you put in, and it is just as much work as making the actual film as well. So that conversation continues. And for me, when I'm doing that, I'm also trying to find a place and a platform to give a voice to my elders. Induaka, I do a lot of work with you, and also with Zana Joshididi as well. And I'm even from the Bharatanatyam community, when we did the Bharatanatyam one, I'm always creating content around that so that you can learn more about it after the fact of the project. Because in the medium of film and TV, you can't put everything all in there in one go. Otherwise, what it feels like is that the audience will feel like they're being lectured. So you need to create that outside of that, and it is an art form in itself to do that. I guess the way that I've been lucky enough to create that sort of change is I've come through recently a initiative through Big Screen, which is a state funding agency here, where I worked for them for 12 months. And then I also worked for I worked for them for 6 months, and then a national broadcaster for 3 months. And then I worked for a production company for another 3 months. And the main focus of that was for me to speak about how change can actually happen and how that policy happens. So to give you an example, one of the discussions that was actually happening was about, I saw a lot of producers putting applications through where it was about, we haven't got that much for development at the moment now. When we get further down with more funding, then we'll start looking at diversity and how we can expand that out. And I had a little bit of an issue with that, because I thought, if you're talking about particularly with an Indigenous community, that the Indigenous community needs to be involved from the start. And there was discussions about, here in Australia, it's very limited sort of budgets. And so there's discussion about, producers, how do they work that budget? How do they get that going? And I kind of flipped it around and just said, look, instead of thinking about the priority being the producer, why don't we think about the priority being the Indigenous community that we're actually representing, and then start from there? And so I feel like the industry, that's not even on their radar at the moment now. There's been a way of working, and to create that change, when you have that opportunity to speak up, you need to speak up. So I've been doing that, and it's a long process, but change will happen.
So there are some questions that have come up in the Q&A, and they're really around, it seems like the people listening to this panel are very enthusiastic and supportive of all of you. And there are questions around how can the community support, specifically around things like funding and awareness. And one of the questions that someone is asking is, as an investor, what should one be aware of and sensitive to in terms of investing in these projects? How to balance inexperience, plot, return on investment, reach of the movie, and emotional connect to the global Hindu cause. So what are some things that you would advise potential investors to keep in mind?
I've had this discussion many a times. Sorry if anyone wants to jump in. As an investor, you've got to think about, there are a number of ways to think about the film, whether you're thinking about it as something that's a return on investment and something that you want to make money from, or is the cultural significance of change worth more than what the dollar value of that actually is? That change, that our future generations will benefit from that. And so the way to look at that is, if there's stories that are being told, the first thing that I look at, from whether it's Hindu or any particular community, the first thing I would look at is, if it's, say for example, we're talking about transgender. If it's a transgender story, is there a writer, a director, or a co-producer or producer that is transgender on that crew? Not just below the line, which is what we talk about, the crewing sort of role, but the positions of power. Have they been given that position of power to inform that story? And are they set up in a place that's a culturally safe space for them to be able to tell that story, not the story that the producer or the filmmaker already has set in their mind, because their lived experience can completely take it somewhere different. So as an investor, you need to make that choice. You can certainly have both, but I can only talk about here in Australia with the budgets that we have. There is a big focus on the impact of making a genuine cultural shift into making sure that those that are underrepresented also own their stories as well. So I'd look at a number of those things and consider that, you know, going in as an investor.
Nico, I think you were about to say something too.
Thank you. Yeah, Ravi touched on a few of the things that I was going to mention as well. But from my perspective, as I've been talking to investors and seeking support for the film, what I've realized is that with almost everybody that I've talked to, there are a few gates which we have to walk through. So the first one is getting to know what the story is, what the project is, why am I the person who's making it, and sort of the whole creative vision around the project, and what, like, to piggyback on what Ravi was saying, and what it can do as far as creating real change and awareness and so forth. And also, I think what I've realized that people are enjoying understanding is that this, for me, this is just the first really of a slate of projects, all in this vein of the Hindu Dharma, that I think are really relevant, wonderful stories to be told. So it's nice to share with your potential investors what the next steps would be next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. So once we get through that creative hurdle of understanding what the project is and who's making it and why it should be us, then of course there's the financial piece. And you know, that's very natural and normal, and correct that we should have that conversation. So, you know, one of the producers on my film, his name is Chris Panazon. He's very well established and he has several independent documentary films to his credit and so forth. You know, he goes in always talking about how documentary films aren't necessarily going to make money. You know, that's not what they're built to do. So that sets kind of the bar. And so then we get into conversation, you know, we have a fiscal sponsor, so it's a 501c3 who's supporting the project. So you can invest as a donor and receive the tax benefits, or you can choose to be part of any potential upsides. You know, in this particular, for our film, yes, we are making this film for a Western audience, but there's a very good chance that it will be received well in India as well. And so there's potential for profit from the film, but we just try to set the bar properly that documentary films don't generally make money. And so we're doing our best to be financially responsible and give options to investors. But we hope that people come and support because, you know, I'm not going to make a lot of money on this project. I'm not expecting to. It's an act of homage, and it's my dharmic duty to do so. And really, you know, it's not like, and I say this to people sometimes, it's not like writing a book. I mean, yes, a book, it takes a lot of time and there's a team around it and so forth, but the practice of filmmaking really is quite a costly venture. And so we require support.
Michael, would you like to?
I think they said everything that I would say. And I mean, both Ravi and Nicholas, just underscoring that fact that if you're investing in this as a way to make money, then that's not that's not why you invest in documentary films. If you want to make change in the world, if that's what's driving you, then, you know, welcome home. You couldn't be in a better place. But I think the same way is when we look at, all right, why are we doing this? You know, a couple of people have said we have to go back to that original drive, that, you know, that question that we have, why are we setting out on this journey? I would say the same things to an investor. Why are you doing this? And if it makes some money on the other side, amazing, that's great. But having a 501c3, a fiscal sponsor set up so that, you know, investors can make these as donations. And then if the abundance comes, wonderful, but that shouldn't, you know, but that's, like Nicholas said, that's not really how the industry is not set up so that we're going to be making a ton of money on these. It's really just to break even. That's nice, you know.
Praneeth, you know, I know you went through some adventures in fundraising for Project Janani. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely sort of ditto everything everyone has said. And the particular challenge for me is that I'm like brand new in this field, and I can't sort of use my experience as something that people would invest in my idea for. So then sort of what I spoke about most and what people connected to is, I mean, we've been sort of talking about it all along, but this need for the story to be told. So the story I'm telling is mostly about diaspora Hindus, Hindus that grew up in the diaspora and sort of the identity crisis that they have. And this is a very real story, and a story that needs to be heard and discussed about. And even though I don't have experience in filmmaking per se, I do have a lot of experience in facing the struggles associated with being a Hindu in the diaspora. And I think that really matters. As Ravichandji was talking about before, like the ones telling the story should be a part of the community facing the struggle, right? And a lot of times when you do get misinformation on topics, it's because the people writing the narratives aren't part of the actual community. So when, and especially in the Hindu community, right, where there's a very small percent, if you need our stories to be told, experience can't necessarily be the only thing you gauge. Sort of, you got to look at the team working behind it and the passion they have at creating a change. And I think that's sometimes a better indicator for what the final product will turn out to be.
Yeah, I think we keep coming back to this idea that we have to think about investment and impact in different ways. And it's not going to be ticket sales and like box office dollars. It's going to be, from the beginning, like understanding, well, what is the purpose of this? What's the goal of creating this? And whether it's it's policy changes, or within the film industry, whether it's policy changes, like Almost Sunrise you were able to use that to help create policy changes, or in the government. It's really about understanding what are we investing in a really different way, in a dharmic way, and not just looking at dollars. But Praneeth, you brought up something, and we talked about this when we had our little pre-session. There are filmmakers out there and films out there where even with the best of intentions, they're taking up Hindu topics in ways that are problematic. So what do you see as your sort of responsibility, your dharma in engaging with those filmmakers? Ravi, you want to start us off?
Sometimes I feel like the energy that I spend trying to educate them, or even trying to convince them of otherwise, of what the impact of I always say it's not just about intention, it's about the impact of what you do and how that impact is received. And there are real life consequences to misrepresenting somebody and in a community. And many of us have been on the receiving end of it. I sometimes feel like you have to gauge whether that filmmaker is, what their aim of that is. A lot of people get into filmmaking because they want to be famous. They want to get their face shown. They think they're going to make $1 million. And you aren't even on the same frequency to have that discussion with those people. But what you can do is work with your community, work with your elders to create something that is the truth. And the truth always sings. And so that's what I throw all of my efforts and everything that I have into, so that work that's created. And look, you, as we were saying before, you may not do, there's so much scope and so much knowledge in Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma that we're not going to always get it right. There's always going to be people that will have a different point of view, or it is, there's a different intersectionality of that. which is completely okay, because then let's make another one. There's always this perception that this will be our one and only chance to get our message, and we need to make sure that we're seen properly in this light, and we'll never get this chance again. That's where our community can support us. There's 1.2 billion Hindus around the world. If each, even like a small percentage of them, supported, commented, liked, did whatever with, and promoted, not even just money, that is a significant amount of support that goes a very, very long way.
Nico.
Well, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier as far as what I feel like my responsibility is as a filmmaker in this space. What I'll add to that, and I don't really have a solution to this issue, but I have not experienced the difficulty, like, Praneeth was saying a moment ago, he's had to deal with, what it means to be part of the Hindu diaspora and so forth. I just haven't had to deal with that. I've got plenty of other issues that I've had to experience in my life, but I don't know what that's like. I can never know what that's like. And that's that. So I have to be aware of that and be humble enough to, to recognize that I'll never be able to. It's like filmmaking in it really, so much of it is what your heart feels and how you are experiencing something. And I can't touch on that side of things. So given that film is a collaborative sport, I have to lean on others in that way and really do my best to bring in those voices and those experiences, and let that reflect in the film. And so I'm really aware of that. And sometimes, it gives me pause, because I don't ever want to be a part of the problem of appropriation and so forth. And so I'm aware of it. And then I just have to lean on the fact that, I'm doing my very best to give expression to these things, and to, in a way that's responsible and dharmic and includes everybody's perspective as best I can, and to tell these stories, which are just so inspiring. And I really couldn't not be telling them. So, because I just feel so very drawn to it. So I'm just aware, awareness. My responsibility is awareness and inclusiveness as best as I possibly can.
Michael.
Yeah, I just would echo everything that's already been said, and obviously my perspective is closer to Nicholas's. What comes up for me is I could compare this a little bit to, if I think about, kind of map it onto the queer experience a little bit, and like homophobic kind of storytelling and the role of allies, and also when people are silent, what that does, what that allows for. So I guess I think about my own responsibility as someone who can see things, maybe as I see sort of like Hindu phobia casually sort of becoming a little more mainstream and accepted and like kind of normalized in progressive spaces, which once felt very, which I thought were my home. You know what I mean? You start to see that stuff if you don't call it out. I think that's something that I think about. So when I see storytelling and I see something that's really problematic and that makes me really uncomfortable, and that I see it's perpetuating some kind of stereotype or whatever thing that is ultimately leading to violence, do I think that I have a right to speak up and say something? And do I have a responsibility to? And I think those are questions that we all should be asking ourselves. And I think in a moment where this is what's happening, being a little more vigilant and looking out for this stuff, instead of just like, oh, well, ooh, that's kind of cringy, I wish that didn't exist, and looking the other way. I think that's what, it's a moment of reckoning with this across all, you know, we have the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's just, we have to just call things out for what they are. So that's what comes up for me when you ask that question.
Yeah. We have at least one or two questions or comments from other filmmakers from the Hindu diaspora around the world, and they're just questions around how can you create community so you can sort of galvanize and mobilize your energy together. So I know through HUA we do want to support the community of dharmic filmmakers, so we can. This is the beginning of conversations and of projects that we're going to do together. So I just wanted to address that. But there's a really sweet question that's come up, which is I think a nice way to begin to, because we're in the last 9 minutes of the discussion. So I'll couple this to the question I have, but the question is, what is the fun part of doing what you do? And I'll add to that, what words of advice and encouragement do you have for Hindus who are thinking of becoming filmmakers? So both of those, what's fun in what you do, and what words of encouragement or advice do you have? We'll start with our youths. We'll start with Praneeth.
Yeah, I think aside from just the creative aspect of it being sort of empowering and being super stimulating for me, just seeing everyone's reactions to what we put out, I think is the greatest part of it. Just seeing people reaching out to me, telling me how this sort of impacts them, or how this sort of changes this field, or telling me how it affected them, how they felt after watching something we've put out. I think that's sort of the most rewarding. I forget about all the pain I went through when someone sends me like a supportive message about something we've put out. It's sort of addicting. It's very addicting.
Ravi?
I think one of the most rewarding things is a lot of the stories that I choose to tell and create is for our younger generations. So it gives them, there's very complex themes, but it gives them a language that they can understand, and a language that they can talk to. And when I see the impact of that, it really resonates with me in a really deep way, because when I was younger and people would say Hinduphobic things to me or racist things to me, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have the vocabulary to fight back. So I just sit there sometimes and just take it, because I didn't, you don't know, you just don't know what to say, and you don't know how to come back with something to say. And then that plays on you, and you think about that for years to come. Even in adulthood, you still think about that. Why didn't I do that? Why didn't I say this? And every moment you're learning things so that if that moment ever happens again, you can tackle that. And to be able to give a child the opportunity and the power and the knowledge to be able to do that is a really big privilege. And I guess the other side for me is I do all this because the legacy of my Nani, my grandma. I only had her for 5 years, and as an adult. And she was the most influential person in my entire life. So I've purposely made, my Nani said to me, "You'll never forget me, will you, when I pass away?" And that's the reason why my logo is the same tattoo that we share, because every time I make a film, I make a story, I write something, I get a chance to talk about her. And that is something that I will carry with.
Nico.
Ravi, that's so beautiful, inspiring. Tears to my eyes, really. It's so beautiful. Filmmaking is so much fun. One of the things when I mentioned earlier that I worked at the UN, and my past life, not really in this life, but like a couple decades ago. And I realized when I started to work in the film world how dynamic it is. And so for my personality, and I often say that I have a lot of Rajasic tendencies, like it's very dynamic, and I enjoy that process of almost the stress that can be related with it. I enjoy it. And also I find that in making this film, the process of sitting down and talking with on camera, having these conversations on camera with these scholars and village elders and so forth, and all of these swamis and pravarashikas and authors, it's just so wonderful to sit down and have these beautiful, oftentimes explosive conversations where things come out that you didn't know they were going to come out, and you're capturing them on film, and it's such a wonderful, and you just create amazing relationships and connections. And so I always say I feel so lucky to be doing this. It's amazing. And for me, again, I can only speak from my own perspective, the process of putting together the story, it's like throwing a bunch of paint onto a canvas, and then you have to figure out how those colors are going to work together and how things are going to match. And when something clicks, when it's a very gratifying feeling when parts of the story just start to align and you see the bigger picture, and you realize that it's actually coming together and you're doing something good, because there's a lot of doubt along the way. So that's a very wonderful process. And as far as what advice I would give to other filmmakers who are just getting into the space, I think that recognizing, honing your ability to recognize talent in others is very key in this game, because there are so many pieces that have to come together. And if you want to make a good project, find other people who are talented, and don't be afraid to shine the spotlight on others, and accept and rejoice in the fact that it's a collaborative process. Know what you're good at, know what you're not good at, know what you love, know what you don't really like about the process, and then really start to find a structure and a team and a group of people that fit with your vision and so forth. Thank you.
The most fun part for me, my gosh, it's really hard. I would say it's probably also simultaneously the thing that makes it so hard that I complain about is the lack of structure, is that there's so many different aspects to this process that you're always doing something different, that I show up in India for 3 weeks and I end up staying for 3 months. I did the same, when I started a film in the Philippines. I was like, this should take me about 4 weeks to do this. And I was there for 4 months, and that was just for the first shoot. Same again. It's that not having routine, being able to chase your dreams and kind of manifest, bring something to life that didn't exist, and the connections that you make along the way. That's what I really value. Is if this whole project that I'm working on right now was to blow up and never happen, these past 3 months would still be amazing, perfect, 100% worth it, just for all the connections I've made, all the experience that I've had. And that's why I feel so grateful to be a part of this, that it's not the same thing that you're showing up to every day. And then for advice, I guess, we're running out of time. I guess the simplest thing I would say after 19 years of doing this, the one thing I would say is meditate. I think that for me, then you'll get your own advice, like just get quiet, listen to yourself, whatever you need, you already know it, it's inside. So be careful about taking too much advice from other people. Your journey is so individual, and we'll all share our experience, from that place. And I'm always happy to do that. But yeah, I think you just need to, if you don't already have a practice, like just have a, just make space to meditate, because that for me has been the biggest game changer of everything.
Well, I could sit and listen to all of you for 17 more hours, because you can feel, and I'm seeing comments and questions that are in the Q&A, that everyone can feel how much this is the space of the heart, that throughout this entire hour and a half, there's been so much humility and heart, and not kind of the ego or the sort of pomposity that people associate with the film industry at all. And so, you know, and I'm seeing hearts coming up in the Zoom. So I want to thank you. I feel expanded for having had this conversation, for having the privilege of knowing all of you. So I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do, for the commitments that you make to this, for allowing me to be your friend and to support you. And the community supports you. I see that constantly in the comments. That's been the running thread. You are supported and you are cherished. And I want to leave on that note, that the work that you do is really important, and that each of you is cherished. So thank you so much. Ankur, I don't know if you have any final words that you want to share.
Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.